other one was medium. You know, it was all right, but it was hot. It was
Yeah.
delivered on time, and I
Okay.
thought, well, maybe I can make it through this, and come find out it wasn't all that.
I don't even remember what we had. I mean, it's been a good long while. So,
It was been barbecue or some sort of fish.
yes, it was some sort of fish, I'm pretty sure that we had. But anyway, well, all right. I
Who
got to
won
go
today?
get rid of these. You got one?
Yeah, you want to go back?
I am.
Yes,
I
you're
got
fine.
two others.
Two others to dispose of.
You're all ready, and then I get up and run away.
What time's class over? Do you know?
Well, what time is it supposed to be over? 11:25.
11:25.
Yeah,
I just never know when the bell's gonna ring. Is this on? It sounds like it.
but you can give us feedback too.
Oh, I don't. Less is better. Less is more for me.
Then we're giving you more.
That's right. Good morning. We're We're going to continue our study of Romans. Before we get started, Andy, can you lead us in a word of prayer, please? Amen. All right, just a real quick recap of what we talked about last week about the book of Romans. As we noted, it's clearly written by Paul. Most historians have no questions about who the writer of this book is. It is Paul. It's written in 57 AD, most likely from Corinth. Paul's on the last part of his missionary journey. He is collecting money for the church in Jerusalem. Paul is he's estimated to be about 51 years old. He's been about 24 years in his ministry. As we stated, most people kind of skip over the first part of Paul's life. It's spent predominantly in Arabia and back in Tarsus, where he was born. So half of Paul's 24 years were spent pretty much in isolation. Then he goes on his 3 missionary journeys, which Luke covers extensively in Acts. And now, he's writing the book of Romans. A little bit kind of towards the end of his career. He will wind up in captivity, in jail, in Rome, in about 2 years. He has never set foot in Rome. The book he's writing to the people of Romans is a bunch of strangers for the most part. He knows about them, he's heard about them, but he doesn't have a ton of personal relationships with the church there in Rome. The church there in Rome has gone through a very unique experience in that around 49, Claudius kicks out the Jews. The Jews have been, most church historians believe the Jews set up the church in Rome, and they were kind of the central members of the church in Rome. The Gentiles come along in a very, obviously, Gentile city, and they become converts to Christianity. And a unique experience occurs when the Jews are asked to leave. So, as with anything else in life, if you're surrounded by a bunch of people with a mixed set of beliefs, a mixed set of heritage, a mixed set of, for lack of a better word, rules, and we can tell from all the writings that Paul does and his books in the New Testament, the Jews set a lot of conditions around Christianity. Conditions that the Gentiles don't necessarily find relevant to their Christian faith. So now the Jews are leaving. The Jews are leaving Rome. And the Gentiles run that church for anywhere between 5 to 7 years. And that's kind of the unique nature of this book. Paul spends a tremendous amount of time in this book trying to help the Jews and the Gentiles reconcile their faith. And so that's kind of the backdrop of what he's writing. As I talked about, most of the church historians believe Romans is the most complete book on Christian faith in the New Testament because of the way it's written. Paul's laying out a tremendous amount of doctrine and understanding of the Christian religion to a group of people he doesn't know, trying to make sure they understand what Christianity is all about, to a group of people he doesn't have a personal relationship with. It is the longest of Paul's books. It's the one that has the most extensive references to the Old Testament. So it is, and John Calvin, Martin Luther think it's the book in the New Testament. If you only had one to study, this was the book you would study. So this morning, I'd like to start off understanding that Paul doesn't know the people for the most part in Rome. I'd like to talk about the people real briefly. There's not a lot to talk about, but talk about the people he mentions in Acts chapter 18. All right. I don't know if we're running short on batteries here. Or I need to get closer. There we go. I'll try and get a little closer. the first person that is mentioned is Phoebe. She's from Caesarea, which is about 5 miles from the city of Corinth, where Paul is currently residing. It's a port city. It's, for lack of a better word, it is the major port in that part of Greece. So with that in mind, Paul spends the fact that he mentions her first is interesting in and of itself, but I commend to you our sister Phoebe, a servant of the church in Caesarea. I ask you to receive her in the Lord in a way worthy of the saints, and to give her any help she may need from you, for she has been a great help to me, great help to many people, including me. Okay, so the New International Version translation there is a little bit suspect. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the word deacon, diakonos, which is translated deacon or servant, depending on where we are in the New Testament. I'm not going to spend any time on that, but the word helper is probably not a very good translation. A better translation of that word is patron. And nobody's really sure why the NIV chooses to use that word. The word patron is clearly what Paul was trying to communicate here. And when you think of patron, what do you think of? What is a patron? Anybody? Sure. Where have you heard the term patron used in your history and your studies? Patron of the arts. Okay, so patron of the arts was somebody who spent a tremendous amount of their own personal wealth to make sure art is available in certain forums, depending on how they choose to do that. So it's very clear here in Paul's writing that Phoebe is someone who has used her financial well-being to continue his works. And she is using her financial well-being to deliver this message, this letter, to the church in Rome. Most historians will tell you that there is no doubt that she is the one who is delivering the letter. She is the actual carrier of the letter. Paul has used other people like that before, Timothy being the one that most of us would pick out, but he's got 3 or 4 other people that are the messengers of his letter. And once again, we have to kind of assume things, and you can disagree with the assumption here, and that's fine. But typically, when the person who is designated as the deliverer of the message, that is the person who will actually read the message when delivered. Now, you can agree or disagree with that, but that is the tradition, that is the history, and it's fairly well documented in secular writing. The person who is the carrier of the letter is the person who will actually read the letter to the church. She clearly has been someone who has stood out. Paul says she's not only been a great help to me, she's been a great help to many other Christians. So Paul is communicating to a group of people he doesn't know. First things first. This is a lady you need to respect. This is a lady who has been a tremendous part of the Christian faith. In Corinth, she's been a tremendous part of the Christian faith as it relates to my works, and she will be a great help to you, both from her success as benefactor, but also in her ability to help, whatever way that was she helped Paul and the others that he mentioned. So Phoebe, it's interesting that she's the first one mentioned. The next one mentioned is the people that I think most of us know. Greet Priscilla and Aquila, my fellow workers in Jesus Christ. They risked their lives for me. Not only I, but all the church of the Gentiles are grateful to them. Okay, so what do we know about Aquila and Priscilla? Larry. Who did they actually teach? Apollos. What was their profession? Tent makers. Who else was a tent maker? Paul. So we kind of picked this up because they're mentioned 5 other times, not counting this reference here in Rome. So let's turn over to Acts 18, and we get introduced to them for the first time. Verses 3 and 4. Paul went to see them. So Now, starting in verse 1. After this, Paul left Athens and went to Corinth. There he met a Jew named Aquila, and a native of Pontus, who had recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla, because Claudius had ordered all the Jews to leave Rome. Paul went to see them, and because he was a tent maker, as they were, he stayed and worked with them. Every Sabbath he reasoned in the synagogue, trying to persuade Jews and Greeks. So Aquila and Priscilla clearly are a part of the group that have been kicked out of Rome. And they end up in Corinth. We don't know why. We obviously know that Paul runs into them and spends time with them. And the way Paul kind of recounts in Romans 16, he says they risked their lives for me. We're not sure exactly when that occurred, but these are two people that Paul spent a tremendous amount of time with. They're people that Paul grew very close to. How many people kind of run their own business? They are, you kind of have your own little operation. Andy, I know you do. And some of you all may have kind of come up through that. Since I left being a consultant in a big company, one of the things I found as I started working with smaller companies is it's a much different relationship. At KPMG, I had relationships, but it was a huge company and you move through people fairly quickly. That's just the nature of the job. Since I've been working with this small engineering firm called Biocore, I know a lot more about those 30 people than I ever did about the people I worked with at KPMG. It was dispersed. It was very distant. We came in touch with people, could be for extended periods of time, but our overlap was very different. We lived in different cities. We had different heritage within the company. We had different expertise. We had different, for lack of a better word, disciplines. At Biocore, everybody's an engineer but Jeff. Okay? Jeff is clearly the outlier. As Larry will tell you, I'm a less of a person because I am not an engineer. I'm less understanding. I'm less knowledgeable. I'm just less. Much appreciated. But I see these people every day. I am in contact with them. My job there is to help them overcome their deficiencies. Okay, not picking on Larry here, but engineers do have deficiencies. But if you're going to work with somebody like Aquila and Priscilla and Paul, you start to understand more about who they are. You just have there's no other position than starting to know them better, to start to interact with them, to understand what makes them tick, to understand why they are what they are. And so Aquila and Priscilla develop a very clear and close relationship with Paul. They risk their lives for him. And then if we go on in Acts 18:18, we see where they stayed there. Paul stayed on in Corinth for some time. Then he left the brothers and sailed for Syria, accompanied by Priscilla and Aquila. Before he sailed, he had his hair cut off in Cenchreae because of a vow he had taken. So Paul not only worked with them, he now is setting sail. And who's accompanying him? These two people. We go on and find their acquaintance with what we talked about before in verse 24. Meanwhile, a Jew named Apollos, a native of Alexandria, came to Ephesus. He was a learned man with a thorough knowledge of the Scriptures. He had been instructed in the way of the Lord, and he spoke with great fervor and taught about Jesus accurately, though he knew only the baptism of John. He began to speak boldly in the synagogue. When Priscilla and Aquila heard him, they invited him to their home and explained to him the way of God more adequately. So Priscilla and Aquila are clearly knowledgeable about the Christian faith. Here comes this man from Alexandria, and Alexandria, if you go through the history of the time we're talking about, Alexandria is the intellectual mecca of that known world. This is a man who spoke, and the word here is fervently, but it also connotes a version of he was a great speaker. He was not only fervent, but he was fluent. He held people's attention. So here's a man who's in the synagogue speaking about Christian faith to a bunch of Jews. And after he was done, he goes and spends time with these two people. And they spend time helping him better understand his Christian faith. So they have a unique role in the New Testament church. And I think one of the things that we don't necessarily comprehend quite as well because of the time in civilization that we live. The way Aquila and Priscilla are written about in the New Testament is extremely unique. They are written of as husband and wife. They're never referred to without the other one being referred to. And they are referenced as a team. The things they do as a team. The way they are presented in the scriptures is as a team. And if you go back through the writings that are of this time and of the writings that come after this time, you would see how truly unique that is. Women in this society are owned. And if you go through the writings that come through this period, even the Jewish writings that have survived, this is not how husband and wives are referred to. This is a very unique way of presenting a Christian couple and the way they go about their lives in the New Testament church. Next, we see them in Corinthians, 1 Corinthians 16, 19. And this is really just a greeting. The churches in the province of Asia send you greetings. Aquila and Priscilla greet you warmly in the Lord, and so does the church that meets at their house. So we know not only have they taken on this role of teaching, this role of being missionaries with Paul, we know when they settle down, when the church comes to meet, they meet in their home. And once again, it's the collective. It's then their home. Now, I've been married a long time, and compared to Julie, I'm patient. Okay, now once again, you got to have your reference sources here. Compared to Julie, I'm extremely patient. We've been in this same house now for, I think, 28 years. We left for a while, about 6 months, and had it redone. And finally, this past year, that house is finally referred to as our home. Until then, you were all invited to Julie's house. And I will quote you on this over and over again. You were not invited to our home. You were invited to Julie's home. Anybody who's ever been invited knows this for a fact. Julie's family laughs about it because occasionally they'll throw in, or you can invite us to your home, to Jeff's home. She goes, no. Now when she's inviting people who are not a member of the family, it'll be referred to as our home because we've come to an understanding 28 years later. But it's the concept that you see here it's Aquila and Priscilla. It's them. They are a team as far as Paul is concerned in his writings and how he refers to them. We go on, and the last reference to them is in 2 Timothy. Okay. Come on. No, it's there. I just can't find it. And once again, this is at the end of the letter to Timothy. Greet Priscilla and Aquila and the household of Onesimus. And it goes on to a bunch more. But that's the last reference we had to them other than Romans. And, I think sometimes, because we don't necessarily understand the history of the writings, they are a pillar of the New Testament church. They kind of represent Paul's, for lack of a better word, rock as he leaves them behind in certain cities. And he constantly refers to them as the couple. Now, once again, I would encourage you all to get and read about historians' views and commentators' views of Aquila and Priscilla. They're pretty far-ranging, and you can draw your own conclusions. But a lot of the writers make reference to the fact that Aquila and Priscilla are referred to as Aquila and Priscilla twice. It's Priscilla and Aquila the other 4 times. She's referenced first. Now, once again, read it and understand it as best you can, and you can kind of come to your own conclusions on that. The only other people that we really know much about in Romans chapter 16 are, and I'm not even going to say the first person's name, and Junia. The interesting thing about them is I think it's interesting that Paul does this. These are the kind of the people that every church has. These are the people who have been Christians a long time. Paul actually says when he's referring to them, let me go over there and greet Junius, my relatives who have been in prison with me. They are outstanding among the apostles, and they were in Christ before I was. So, as you know this, they've been prisoners. They say the term relative there, you can do your own study on that. It may not be actual flesh and blood relatives. Most people believe they were, but that word doesn't actually translate that way all the time. But I think the thing that Paul wants people to understand is these are grounded people. These are people who you can build around. These are people you can go to for that elder statesman in the faith. They're the people, if you're having a problem and you want to know what life can throw at you, go see them. And I think that's ultimately, if you look at our Christian faith, that's kind of how you'd like to see a church grow. You'd like to see the people who've been there and been a part of founding the church and being a part of nurturing the church are the people that, as the church grows, people turn to. And that's who Paul's referring to here. These are the 2 people that he has a very unique description of, and he references them in a very peculiar way. Little is known of the others. It says Paul has 2 relatives. Those are the 2 we just went through. It's a mix of people. There are 17 men and 10 women referenced. 2 we don't know who they are. It's really hard to tell based on their name, whether they were male or female. And then it's very clear because of the way Paul writes it. When he talks about the households of, that means that there were slaves as a part of the church there in Rome. And we know that from all the other writings in the New Testament. But this is a very diverse church. These are people who are wealthy. These are people who have trades. These are people who have households. These are people who are slaves. These are people who are Gentiles. These are people who are Jews. So if you think about the church in Rome, it is immensely diverse. And so Paul is writing to this diverse group of strangers and trying to lay out the gospel for them so that they can have a complete, as he says, a complete understanding of the gospel. Now, once again, as we mentioned last week, this is a church that probably has had no apostolic leadership at all. There's no reference to any of the apostles being in Rome prior to Paul's arrival a couple years from now. So they are a church that is organically grown, and they probably were established by the people from Rome who returned from Pentecost. So this is a church that's very much like you would see in any other organic church. It grows through their faith, it grows through the meetings of the people in the community, and it grows as a unit as it develops. Next, I'd like to kind of go through what we're going to be studying the next several weeks. The first part of the book is typical of Paul's letters in verses 1 through 17. He basically gives you an introduction, but unlike most of Paul's introductions, this one's a little unique in that he covers a lot of ground. In chapters 1 through 4, he wants the readers, and once again, he's trying to establish some things with these readers. He wants them to understand why they need the gospel. Next, he spends a tremendous amount of time on what are the blessings you receive by receiving the gospel. Next, he talks about the gospels and the Israelites. He then talks about the gospel and the Gentiles. And then the part that I think we kind of pass over is, what are the practical implications of the gospel? What is it that makes your life better because of the gospel? And then lastly, he's going to go through kind of the conclusion. And I think as you start to, next week we'll start with the introduction. As you read through that, pay particular attention to what Paul says in those first 17 verses. And if you have time, look at his introductions to his other letters and compare and contrast. Paul's introduction in Romans is very different than his introductions in the other books that he writes. He spends a lot of time trying to lay out some groundwork for what he's going to cover. And I think if you, as we kind of get ready for that study, if you turn over to Romans 1, and the last part of that introduction, Paul lays out kind of almost the fervor of which he's going to write this book. I am not ashamed of the gospel, because it is the power of God for the salvation of everyone who believes, first for the Jew, then the Gentile. For in the gospel, a righteousness from God is revealed, a righteousness that is by faith, from the first to the last, just as is written, the righteous will live by faith. So Paul lays that out before he actually gets into the study of the book. And he lays out the kind of the themes that he's going to cover, which is, as Andy said when I asked him what he thought of Romans, he thought of grace, which I kind of went back to Andy and said, I had kind of prepped Andy and Larry for conversations last week. I asked him in the future when I ask him to prep to give me more than one word. I loved his conciseness, but it doesn't create a lot of flow when your response back is grace, which is true. That is what the book covers. But he also talks about this distinction between Jews and Gentiles. And as we went through the outline, Paul specifically is going to address each of those groups individually because he has a problem here. He has a congregation that is clearly going through a reacclimation of the Jews into these churches. And, we don't know the actual thoughts there, but you can imagine the Jews have come back to a Gentile-run church. And there's some things that have been lost as far as the Jews are concerned. There are some traditions that are no longer being followed. So we'll pick up starting in Romans chapter 1 next week. Thank you.